today I'm talking about crypto. And I say unfortunately because when I teach securities regulation, when the day comes around to teach about whether crypto coins and all of this is considered a security, I have routinely for at least the last 4 years had someone come and guest lecture that day because I, like maybe John Reed Stark and a few others, have always just sort of hoped this would go away and be turned into just maybe the potential house of cards that it may or may not be. But it is here, and it is here to stay under this administration. So we need to all figure out what's going on with it. So what's going on with it is a lot and a lot of change. Mark Uyeda, who's the acting SEC commissioner right now until Paul Atkins is confirmed on day one, really on January 21st, the day after the inauguration, went ahead and rescinded some of the previous guidance the SEC had given or the previous requirements the SEC had put in place regarding crypto assets. So that was Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 that had been issued in 2022. And just on, well, I guess it was January 23rd, we had this, so a couple days after the inauguration, they published Staff Accounting Bulletin 122, which rescinded 121. And so what does that mean? Well, 121 had additional safeguards in place regarding crypto assets. And a lot of this regards sort of how you account for these assets on your books, and requiring, where you're putting liabilities and assets and all that, and ensuring, again, that you have some ability to have these required safeguarding obligations regarding those assets. 122 did away with a lot of that. So we'll see, again, I think a shift in how these assets are being recorded or potentially not. This sort of 121 required additional disclosures and things like that I think are going to fall by the wayside for the most part. But in a bigger sense, that is, I think, in some of the nitty-gritty technical practical applications that will immediately shift. But the bigger discussion maybe is the crypto task force that was also set up. That was the one set up on January 21st. And it is in alignment with the executive order that Trump signed also on January 23rd. That was called Strengthening American Leadership in Digital Financial Technology. So again, there's a major groundswell to make sure that crypto is, front and center for certainly the SEC and many other financial regulatory bodies. So the crypto task force, we're starting to see this set up. Commissioner Hester Peirce is the chair of it. And she has been called Crypto Mom, a term I really don't love, but she's been called that for the last, few years because of her sort of repeated criticism of any SEC enforcement actions in this space. And so just a couple of days ago, she came out with a splash with sort of this first public statement or sort of speech she was giving about this crypto task force. And true to form, it is very colorful and has a story about her childhood. And, her speeches and statements are usually entertaining, to say the least. But it outlines some of the goals of this new task force, which unsurprisingly is, very pro crypto industry. But she, I think, spins it in a way that it feels somewhat palatable, and that she says, let's get a lot of definition around here. What is considered a security? What's not? What things will fall outside of SEC jurisdiction? Which coins or token offerings will be considered part of this framework or not? And then talking through, the path forward for registration of certain offerings, or, just it had a tone of like, let us work with you, come to us and talk to us, and we'll give you a no action letter if there are certain things that, we don't think would fall under our jurisdiction. So it seemed to be a promise for additional clarity and definition. And again, with this idea that, it sounds like, this new uncharted territory we can all step into. It sort of rings of like, the space race in the 60s, I think, of this sort of like, look at this brand new frontier we can all tackle, and there's so much good to come out of this, and we will go into this together. Um, so where this goes and what actually is happening with this, I think, is tricky. I think the rescinding of SAB 121 is going to, I think at the end of the day, there are less regulatory protections in this space, despite this sort of, again, positive spin that this could be, working with crypto industry hand in hand to sort out what might be a brand new sort of frontier uh, for sort of any sort of financial transactions in this space. So I don't know what else really to add to this. I know this has been fairly descriptive of just what has been happening, but like I said, this is all sort of just in the last few days that this is getting set up. And I think this will be a place where, like I said, if you have any sort of crypto product, you're going to be well received at the commission, and they will. That's the takeaway.
So, Mr. Kelly, you have a question and/or comment?
I do. First, I might as well just plant my flag, which I think most listeners will already know about crypto. Like, this is a thing that serves no useful legal purpose in the universe. It serves a lot of useful illegal purposes, but really, you're either using it for wild speculation, in which case you're either rich or stupid. You shouldn't be playing with crypto unless you are a billionaire or above, or you're a drug runner cartel and you need to avoid tax authorities and whatnot. That's the only reason there is. I guess, though, my questions are probably two. And Karen, I don't know if you could answer them, but even if the SEC adopts a regulation, I get that they want to end regulation by enforcement. However, given the Supreme Court's recent decisions to curb regulatory authority, it seems to me like regulation by regulation isn't really going to be a thing anymore either, because so easily a new rule could be challenged. So wouldn't that be true here? And then my other question is, for all of this, wouldn't banking regulators still also have interest in how people are using crypto? Because there's going to be a lot of illegality in the actual transactions. So I'm still confused about how on earth does anybody think this is ever going to be a legitimate part of, I don't know, securities trading and money transactions. It's just not.
No, I think all that's correct. I think there's still a significant overlap in jurisdiction between the SEC, the CFTC on these as for being potential futures. And then you're right. If this is sort of some sort of actual currency, the banking regulations should also apply here. And one would hope they would, for exactly the reasons you said. There should be some regulation in this space, especially for the things that might not be considered securities, like these NFTs or other things that will be swirling in this space. And to your point about regulation by regulation, I think we've discussed this topic in previous episodes when we talk about the foxes are now running these hen houses. And so now what do we do if, like, are they going to try to just decimate these agencies? I think the answer is yes for some. But when you have an agency like the SEC, you have people who maybe have some vested interest in retaining some power in that agency, but that is sort of at odds with the zeitgeist of just sort of saying, we want less regulation. So to your point, are they going to additionally regulate here? And then, almost regardless of who's in power, we have a post-Loper Bright world where everything will get challenged, and maybe very successfully, if there is sort of any thought that this is the SEC stepping outside of its congressional mandate in any way. So I think your point is fair, which is, they sort of have gotten what they wanted, and now what they wanted is everything they might do also will be equally challenged and maybe put aside. And hopefully in that space, someone else will fill the gap. As we said before, blue skies, who knows? There might be some way that we get our arms around regulating this Wild West.
Mr. Marks, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, this goes to the theory of idiocy. So the American Banking Association actually praised the repeal of SAB 121 so that the banks can now offer their clients secure digital asset services, which is kind of ironic because if you think about what they're really used for, as Matt said, illicit activities, how are they monitoring all of this stuff? And I think that's the biggest question of them all, is that, you're taking away all of the alleged controls that we're trying to put in place, and everybody knows that it's usually for nefarious activities by most, or by most is probably bad, but by some. But you know, okay, you take it away. Now, how do you the whole thing is just stupid. I don't understand any of it. And I agree. I mean, if you dabble in cryptocurrency, it's either because, um, you got a ton of money to lose, or you're doing something that's just not right. So these are my personal opinions, by the way. I mean, I don't know what anybody else thinks, but to me, I thought SAB 121 was at least a step in the right direction, and then but then the American Banking Association comes out and applauds the repeal. I don't understand. Somebody needs to help me understand all this. I just don't get it.
I don't know if I'm the person to help you understand.
I
Mr.
think,
Armstrong.
I was going to say, Jonathan M., I think you're right. And I think, Matt, you're right as well. And one of the differences, maybe, Matt, with other things is it's often the sort of, the chicken master and the fox and the chickens that are at it. Whereas with, conventional Ponzi schemes, there's normally, a bank or something that eventually, almost like Scooby-Doo, the mask comes off and we realize who the real person was behind it. But with a lot of crypto platforms, you don't do that. And a lot of them are fairly opaque. And I know we've talked on this podcast before about a crypto scheme that seemed to be Trump branded. And I think I traced back to a vape shop in Utah. And so things that seem, in the olden days, both in the UK and the US, we used to build our banks strong. And a lot of architecture relating to banks has big columns at the front. And the reason for that was to make people trust them. There was a signal, a soft signal through architecture that you could trust this bank. And it's easier to do these soft signals online with cryptocurrency. And that's partly why a lot of people get sucked in. If we look at the OneCoin scandal in the UK, I've a relative of a relative who's lost her house through gambling in crypto. And yes, we can say she was stupid, but her kids weren't. And this affects real lives, and we shouldn't understand that. We shouldn't fail to understand that when we tinker with regulation, people suffer. And these are kids that have had a life-changing event and have seen their family home repossessed because their mum traded crypto because she was told by people it was a great idea.
Yeah, I don't mean to pick on football players, and Nikki Glazer, but Nikki Glazer even said Gronk knows that crypto's not real money. So, Tom Brady loses $30 million. It's a drop in the bucket. But to your point, Jonathan, other folks and Matt said it best. You're either a billionaire or have money to burn, or you're doing something that's just not right. I ask people all the time, what's cryptocurrency? And they can't explain it. So if you can't explain it to me, it can't be a good thing.
Well, with that, Matt Kelly, what do you have for us?
I have changes in enforcement priority at the Justice Department, which came to light this week. So we are recording on Friday. On Wednesday, our new Attorney General here, Pamela Bondi, she was sworn into office. She was sworn in by none other than Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. He of the many accusations of conflicts of interest and corruption himself. So there is a certain poetry there to that scene. However, Ms. Bondi showed up at the Justice Department on Wednesday and promptly fired off at least a dozen memos about changes in enforcement priorities at the Justice Department. The long story short is that the department is really going to wrench itself away from a lot of what corporate compliance officers have understood for the last better part of 20 years, really, that it is going to be a huge focus on internal immigration enforcement, crackdowns on so-called sanctuary cities, and a lot of other, use of department resources to enforce immigration law or lack thereof at the state, local, and federal level. A lot of crackdown on corporate use of DEI, including the potential for criminally investigating companies for having DEI programs. And I know, Karen Moore, you want to talk more about that, so I'll set that aside, but that is another certainly potentially troubling thing for corporations. But for those of us who are most involved in FCPA issues, the big change is that really the FCPA unit wasn't disbanded, but Ms. Bondi did say that FCPA will now be focused on FCPA offenses that somehow implicate drug cartels, transnational gangs, human trafficking, all in alignment with a executive order that President Trump signed, where he said it's going to be all about eradicating drug cartels and criminal gangs and related activity like that. So enforcement of the FCPA against corporate bribery like we're used to. Corporation bribes a foreign government overseas or foreign government officials overseas to win a business contract. That will be way, way down on the priority list if it gets enforced at all. FCPA enforcement that somehow involves, she has the actual quote here according to her memo, bribery of foreign officials to facilitate human smuggling and the trafficking of narcotics and firearms. That's the sort of FCPA offense that now will get attention. So people might think, okay, that's kind of weird. And I'm not even sure exactly what that sort of criminal misconduct would look like, but that's what the FCPA would be used for. However, the big change is that local U.S. attorneys will now be able to bring their own FCPA cases along those lines without first getting the blessing of Main justice in Washington, D.C. In fact, the policy for 20 years had been local U.S. attorneys really couldn't bring their own FCPA cases at all. Only the fraud section at the Justice Department could do that. Well, now any U.S. attorney can bring an FCPA case, but the sort of offenses that would qualify that you are allowed to bring are going to be much narrower in scope. I've been trying to think through, therefore, what sort of companies and corporate transactions will or won't get more pressure here. So, for example, if you're a big tech company selling software or hardware to foreign governments that want to restock their ministry of whatever with better IT equipment, and you suddenly have a fixer who wants to pay a bribe or a reseller who wants to offer discounts, and we all know what that really means, like that's not going to get enforcement attention anymore. On the other hand, if you are a transnational shipping company that does business in a lot of Latin America, or you are, I don't know, like maybe a business that helps to get student visas to bring people into the United States, potentially you could see not more FCPA enforcement, but more punches coming at you from different directions. So instead of having one big heavyweight boxer socking you in the face at being Main justice in the fraud section, you're going to have a lot of little flyweight or bantamweight boxers punching at you all the time in the form of U.S. attorneys. And I know I've just upset many U.S. attorneys by using that bantamweight analogy. I apologize. Nonetheless, for a big global corporation, that's what you're going to have to think about. And I would welcome others to try and help me understand how that would really affect the compliance risks you need to worry about. A couple of more changes that I'll go through here, kind of like hopscotch, and then wrap it up. The crackdown on Russian kleptocrats, that's gone. Again, no surprise when you consider that who is Ms. Bondi's boss is Donald Trump, and who does he have a giant man crush on? Vladimir Putin. So easy going on the Russian oligarchs. No more enforcement there. But I would presume we're still going to see more sanctions enforcement against places like Russia, not Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela, maybe. Because you'd think that the administration will still want sanctions enforcement as a tool, but against different countries, our more clear geopolitical adversaries. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Russia was our adversary, which was 2 months ago, but I guess they're not anymore. And then my last thing is that there are going to be more resources allegedly devoted to anti-money laundering as part of the crackdown on cartels. Again, makes a lot of sense. The cartels are using money laundering up to their eyeballs to run their operations. And this is going to be interesting because if you're paying a bribe and doing an FCPA violation with the cartels, I would presume you know it, or somebody in your organization knows what they're doing. But if you are a financial services firm and somebody is using you to commit money laundering, you might not know that. But if the department is paying more attention to money laundering as part of its crackdown and eradication of cartels, then what are your compliance risks if you're in financial services? Assuming they don't all flock to crypto, like we were just talking about. But that's the kind of thing that we're going to have to grapple with. And this is all still very early to understand how this shakes out. From a practical matter, you still have to wonder, are we going to have any prosecutors doing any of this at all? Because Bondi is also devoting a lot of them to rounding up illegal immigrants, investigating the investigators who were looking at Donald Trump. There's a lot of weaponization of the department now, and investigating DEI programs. So for all of our talk about is compliance going to be good, bad, or otherwise, maybe the risk is still there theoretically. Maybe it's higher in some ways, lower in other ways. But if there's no actual bodies at the department looking at this, does any of that make a difference? I have no idea, but there's going to be a lot to think about in coming weeks and months.
I would just add, Matt, the macadorial plants in northern Mexico would not surprise me at all if they're baking in payments for security. So they probably ought to take a look at that. Maquiadoria. Questions or comments for Matt?
Yeah, I've just got a comment. I think the international piece will be interesting. What we've seen sometimes is when there's a failure to prosecute in the US, then other prosecutors sometimes step up to the plate. And that might be, Germany, for example, if we're looking at the corruption area, maybe even the French. The UK SFO has obviously got a few more resources and is keener on dawn raids. But then there's that whole conflict, isn't there, I guess, that let's say it were a US corporation. What does Trump then do where it should have been the prosecutor of first resort? Do they block things? Do we have something a bit like the ICC where the prosecutors themselves are sanctioned by Trump because they're getting involved in something that they shouldn't? So it has an absolute recipe for disaster, I think, particularly when elements of the Trump administration are making people in traditionally very friendly countries quite hostile. I was up in Finland last week, for example. It's quite rare that you see enraged Finns. It's quite rare that you see enraged Danes, but they're certainly not happy with the whole Greenland adventure.
Well, Jonathan, I think you bring up a couple of good points we should all remember. So, number one, just because Donald Trump wants to be friends with Russia, Europe doesn't. So while we are retreating on enforcement against kleptocrats, Europe is still terrified of Russia for very good reason, and they're still looking to try and contain Russian ambitions in some way, shape, or form. So how would this work if U.S. sanctions against Russia are really a dead letter, but the EU is still enforcing it, and you're a global company? You'll have to think that through. Your point about coordinating international investigations and settlements is a good one. And we should note that the U.S. Justice Department, several of the top attorneys for coordinating international efforts and outreach, they've either been dismissed or driven out or fired or whatnot, but they're not there. So if there is going to be a big sprawling anti-corruption case, if the US isn't taking a lead, how is that going to work? It'll be still there, but maybe less sprawling. But with all due respect to some international regulatory and legal authorities, I don't know that they know how to do this as well without the US sort of setting the pace, which frankly it had for the last 20 years. So there's going to be a lot of that too. And how the geopolitical stuff shakes out will have implications for this. And then the last point that I will bring up, and I will credit the eminence grise of corporate compliance, Joe Murphy, who he pointed out on LinkedIn that the retreat from FCPA enforcement, from corporate bribery, is not good for U.S. businesses, because now all these corrupt officials are going to know, I should stand my ground to shake you down. It's not like when you say we don't pay bribes anymore. It's not like you can't. Of course you can. Your president just said he doesn't care about enforcing it. So they're going to hold you up for corruption and bribes, which is not anything any CEO wants, even if they're not above that. Like, they don't want to pay a bribe, but if they have to, they will. And I frown upon all of that. But if you're going to have more government officials overseas hitting up your company for bribery because now they think they can get away with it, that does nobody any favors in the compliance office, in the legal office, in the finance office, or anywhere else in the corporation.
All right, Karen Moore, what do you have for us? You're on mute, Karen. You were with us.
Sorry, trying to find the button. It looks like a new platform, so my apologies. I was just saying, I'm sorry to say that DEI is very much on my mind at the moment. Again, I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted by thinking about it. So for one last time, I hope let me just talk about what's going on with DEI. It's not a new topic. The acronym seems to date back all the way to the 60s and the Civil Rights Act. Although alongside the rise of the Me Too movement and the increase in ESG initiatives, the actual branding ramped up significantly in the wake of the George Floyd murder in 2020. So DEI really became this kind of brand for companies. I want to cynically say maybe it became a bit of a flavor of the month type of initiative, a bandwagon on which a lot of companies jumped. C-suite chief DEI officer positions and whole departments were created out of whole cloth. In some cases, a February 2023 LinkedIn study showed 169% growth in chief DEI appointments between 2019 and 2022, a momentum that has since slowed. I think those initiatives generally immediately invited criticism and cynicism, even among optimists like me, that there was a lot of talk, maybe a lot of show without a lot of substance. Racism claims abounded, terms like woke agenda and movements against affirmative action programs in higher education were much bandied about. So I don't want to be myself too cynical, because I think a lot of companies had really good intentions there, and those kind of new positions and new offices were intended at least to reflect some good faith effort to address DEI issues within their organizations. But all this was even before Trump's executive order that we talked about in the past, and which Matt referenced, that was intended to address and effectively eliminate DEI programs within the federal government, but also in its dealings with government contractors. Not to mention its kind of instructions to the EEOC on how they enforce gender provisions, this recognition of only two genders contained in another executive order. And all of that was before Pam Bondi's memorandum that Matt also mentioned, which were instructions to the DOJ to bring prosecution into private companies, examining whether their DEI policies and programs violate civil rights law. To me, when I read that, admittedly kind of late at night, it just brought to mind bringing the government into the bedroom to start regulating what happens between two consenting adults, something that I feel like we've gotten past. It raises questions on company policies and their approaches and their own rights. Can a company now not recognize and defend gender identities beyond male, female for fear of being prosecuted? That the Supreme Court says that gender identity should be protected under Title VII, but There's suggestion now that maybe it shouldn't be protected. So, all of that is kind of in turmoil. And to me, at the moment, it feels very much like DEI has a branding problem. It's almost like a marketing issue, because once you look behind the curtain, pre-existing the brand, organizations were already addressing a wide range of issues associated with diversity in the workplace, equitable treatment, inclusive employee engagement. Some of these initiatives may have been more effective than others. Some of them may have been a bit ham-handed, but all credit to functions like HR and compliance, which have been grappling with policies and procedures to address discrimination, ensure accessibility, promote a sense of belonging, because they know it's good for business and because it's already the law. We've got Title VII, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have all sorts of protections, but beyond that, companies, I believe, rather than pursuing a woke agenda, and just if I could go off on that for a moment, I don't understand what the problem with woke is if you think that all woke means is opening your eyes, being awake, recognizing that there's still work to be done, recognizing that there's not a level playing field and that maybe more should be done to create a level playing field within organizations, because that's the right thing to do. It creates a broader potential workforce that you can employ. It creates a sense of belonging and engagement within your organization. And if there are obstacles to doing so, why wouldn't a company want to engage in practices that make that better? There was a long time ago, a short video, I think that's used more in schools to kind of illustrate this, where a bunch of young people entering the workforce are lined up on the goal line of a football field and said, we're going to have a 100-yard race. But before we start, I want everyone who grew up with two parents to take a big step forward. I want everyone whose parents own the house in which they grew up in to take a big step forward. I want everyone who does not know somebody who is the victim of violent crime to take a big step forward, et cetera, et cetera. And then, they ask the kids to look around. Where are you on this playing field? Now run the race. And they run the race. And, some of the implications are the kids that are left behind, who are really disadvantaged, run the race faster and they're trying harder. Maybe there's a subtle implication that the kids that had a lot of advantage and privilege wouldn't try as hard. But I think the bigger message there was that at the end, people ended up where they needed to be. They ended up at the end of the 100-yard race, more or less in equal line, or maybe more or less based on their natural ability to run a race. And from that, we see a lot of the kind of messages on affirmative action and companies that are trying to seek to attract a broader workforce because it's the right thing to do. And I wonder, in that regard, how Donald Trump feels when he gets onto a golf course and people are handicapped in order to level the playing field and ensure a really good and competitive game. I mean, I don't really understand what the differences are. So my kind of last tirade, I hope for a while, Tom, on DEI initiatives is going to be a rebranding exercise, a reframing of the whole approach within companies, hopefully to fly below Pam Bondi's radar, because these initiatives that companies are undertaking, maybe some of them were misguided, maybe some of them were ineffective, maybe some of these DEI departments didn't need to be created, but the issues remain, the issues are still there, companies should still be doing it, just maybe flying under the radar a little bit, going about its business because it's important business to undertake. That's my kind of tirade of the moment.
Mr. Armstrong.
Yeah, I think this is a real dilemma for businesses, and whether or not we think that some DEI initiatives have gone too far or whatever position we take on this. I was with a client yesterday who's already experiencing these real issues. They do a lot of US government contracting, and so feel under pressure already to change their website, to change some of their initiatives. And they'd quietly canvass the fact with some people, and then a whole bunch of happen to be Gen Z, but let's not single them out for that, just said, more or less, if the website changes, then we go, because this is something that they care about. And so, if you're the head of compliance in that situation, you're in a really unenvious position. If they stay, you've lost your source of income. If you hold on to your income, then you risk losing the next generation of talent. It's not an easy decision for any corporation. And insofar as you can, you've just got to think through these challenges and work a path through. But that's going to have to be a path through that also takes into account things like European legal requirements. If you have a workforce over here, if you're seen to disadvantage them by changing some of your corporate statements, changing your website, then you may open yourself up for discrimination claims over here. So there's a tightrope, go walk it.
Well, Mr. Marks, are you still with us? There he is. What do you got for us, Mr. Marks?
What do I got? I'll give it my best. So the question was asked with regards to what can internal audit do with regards to export controls compliance or export controls. So, I think the first task here is maybe just to define what is export controls and export controls compliance. So, obviously regulations that govern the export or re-export and transfer of goods, which includes, by the way, technology and services across borders. That certainly falls into the purview here. And the whole purpose, it's really designed to protect national security, enforce foreign policy, and prevent sensitive materials from reaching unauthorized parties. And so that's, a lot of people just don't understand that. And then sort of the major U.S. regulations of all of this, and there are others for sure, but there's the Export Administration Regulations, which are the EAR. They're overseen by the Bureau of Industry and Security, the BIS, and they cover dual use goods. And then there's the ITAR, which I think we've heard a lot about, which is the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation. And that's managed by the State Department, and they regulate defense-related exports. And then there's OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which obviously administers sanctions, programs restricting trade with specific countries and entities. So the risk associated with noncompliance is also important to really understand here before we get into what internal audit needs to do. So obviously there's legal and financial risks associated with this, and then violations can lead to heavy fines, criminal charges, and debarment from government contracts, which really for some could be a death sentence. There are several companies that have faced multi-billion-dollar penalties for violations. I'm not going to mention them. I think we all know who they are. Obviously, reputational damage for noncompliance, negative press, loss of customer trust, things like that, and shareholder concerns certainly related to, export controls. Obviously, a publicized violation, really can cause long-term broad damage, to an organization. And especially in sensitive industries, like, for example, aerospace is one that I could think of, defense, and certainly technology, which I kind of mentioned before. And then there's obviously operational disruptions, supply chain disruptions, if licenses are actually revoked or restrictions are imposed. Everyone's so concerned about supply chain today, but a lot of people don't understand really what the ramifications are from an export controls perspective, which is really interesting. Then there's obviously, from an operational perspective, again, loss of market access in key regions and companies that are actually become blacklisted, problematic. National security risks certainly comes into play. Sometimes I was involved a long time ago with the accidental transfer of dual use technology. which means that civilian tech is paired with military applications, without a company actually really thinking through or knowing about that, to unauthorized parties. That became a real issue. And then there's cyber threats, if controlled data is exposed to foreign adversaries. So there's a bunch of things here that certainly are risks and risks of noncompliance. So that if we get into the role of internal audit now, and what they can do, obviously ensuring compliance frameworks are in place is certainly one thing. That seems to be ever changing though. But internal audit should really evaluate whether the organization has a couple of things in place. Robust policies and procedures for one, that align with the regulations that I mentioned, the EAR, ITAR, and OFAC requirements. There should be clear responsibilities assigned for export compliance. I mean, somebody needs to really take ownership of all of this. Obviously, we all talk about this, and this becomes ultra critical here when it comes to export controls. Training programs for employees handling controlled items or controlled data, certainly something. I've been involved again in developing training initiatives, and I've sat in on seminars and things like that, and it seems like export controls is sort of one of those things that's talked about sometimes, either in its totality or it's kind of brushed off. So I mean, certainly that certainly becomes a play here for internal audit. Risk assessments and monitoring. Auditors should conduct risk assessments to identify a couple of really key things here, in my opinion. Certainly high risk transactions, products, or specific business units that could be problematic. They should identify gaps in compliance programs that could lead to violations. They should regularly monitor red flags. And, red flags obviously doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong, but should force people to stop and reassess. And those red flags, just a couple of, just real quick. I know we're up against a couple of things here, but shipments to embargoed countries, for example. A lot of organizations don't necessarily track those or identify those. Or the other thing, which I think is pretty interesting, unusual customer requests related to product specifications or destinations. Much like with a vendor, or somebody in payroll changing, where they want their payroll sent or where they want to be paid. When a customer makes a request to change certain things, product specifications is one, or the destinations on where the products are supposed to be going, that should really be looked at very closely. So any type of those changes, really from an internal audit perspective, is a good thing to really start looking at. And then going into sort of the next deep dive of this, which is the testing phase, and auditing these controls, internal audit, these are some of the things that, again, from my experience, should do. Obviously, transaction testing, which I'm a big fan of, to ensure compliance with licensing and classification rules. That's one. Data analytics, which we keep talking about, to flag anomalies in export transactions. You really need to understand all of this, though, in order to set that up. Everybody thinks data analytics is as simple as running data, but if you don't understand what the desired outcomes are supposed to be, your data analytics is just nothing. It's garbage. Obviously, third-party due diligence, which we all have talked about ad nauseum, but audits to assess compliance risks in supplier and distributor relationships. That's another thing that certainly, from a testing perspective, incident response and investigations. Internal auditors should evaluate if the company has strong reporting mechanisms for potential violations. I remember long ago that a company had a hotline in place, but they said, well, if we have if it's not really related to fraud or ethics, then we don't really use the hotline. We have another channel. Like, well, that's not good. So, obviously, a proper reporting mechanism for potential violations is something that really we should be paying attention to. And then the other thing, obviously, triaging allegations and investigations that have to be handled appropriately, and corrective actions obviously need to be implemented on a timely basis. The other key thing that I really wanted to point out here is that, and we talk about this a lot too, but it's really important that internal audit collaborate with legal and compliance. They can't be isolated or siloed here. So, they should not work in isolation by any stretch of the imagination. Strong partnerships with legal and compliance, and obviously the supply chain teams, which I mentioned, really do ensure an integrated approach to managing these export risks. And they open up lines of communication. So the more transparent, the more information, obviously, the better internal audit can do with regards to designing their testing and, making sure that they really understand exactly what those particular risks are within an organization. So really just to kind of just bring this back in, export controls compliance is not just a legal requirement. It's a critical component of risk management and corporate responsibility, which is why we're talking about it today. And internal audit does play a key role in ensuring that, obviously, a proactive compliance approach, which would be mitigating risks and strengthening corporate governance, are really tantamount to really trying to get in front of all this. So companies that take export controls seriously not only avoid or can potentially thwart legal trouble, but they actually build trust with regulators, customers, and their global partners. And we all want to do business with people that we trust and people that are obeying the laws and following the guidelines and the regulations. So hopefully today I provided you with a small glimpse or a structure that was at least informative for you to ask more questions or to really double check exactly what your internal audit group or your internal audit department is doing, and allow you to tweak and modify your approach accordingly, because this is a risk. Companies have been fined, and it's something that, again, it's like, when you ask people about cryptocurrency and to define it, if you ask people about export controls, oftentimes, more often than not, I get really silly answers. So, hopefully this was informative, and, the audience will have some takeaways.
Karen Moore, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. I was really interested, Jonathan, to your comment about changes to the destination of the product or to the product specification, which may either intentionally or inadvertently be designed to avoid export controls or restrictions. Is that a workflow issue? Is that just making sure that in the process of getting something to where it needs to be, that there are some checks and balances? Or is there a broader implication there? Because it does seem to me something that's really ripe for a bit of corruption to get somebody to change some specs or to change an end destination or the flow through country nefariously, where a workflow maybe wouldn't catch it. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
I think it goes back to logic and sense. I hate to go back to the old Star Trek stuff, but if it's not logical, then obviously somebody should follow up with it. If somebody's asking for a product specification, again, the organization that's actually doing the work for your manufacturing the product or distributing the technology, they should understand exactly what those ramifications are for those specific changes, and if it could be used nefariously. And then with regards to changing destination, obviously, you have organizations or countries that are less riskier than others. If somebody's doing business in London and they want stuff that, to be shipped to Venezuela for some reason or some other country, I'm not discriminating against countries here, but, you have to understand, is there some logical reason for that if they don't have any type of presence there? And so, again, it really goes back to, the old trust but verify, but also, it goes back to common sense. Not just trying to placate a customer to make changes and keep the business, but do these things make sense? Or do these things, meaning changing the product spec or changing the destination of the shipment of the product, do they add additional red flags to this relationship that requires further review and discussion? And I think that's really what this is all about. It's an awareness exercise. It's a communication exercise. And that's where I think that, people that are, in procurement, or people that are on the manufacturing side, or people that are in supply chain or internal audit, legal and compliance, really can't work anymore in isolation. When these things come up, there should be a plan in place, to really identify, to bring those to the next level and have those things reviewed. I call it the 4 eyes principle, and other parts of, when we're doing compliance or internal audit, I think the same applies here. But great question.
All right, Mr. Armstrong, you're batting 5th today. You want to take us home?
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah. I had the privilege of speaking to the Synthesis Institute at Xavier University as a guest lecturer this week, and I think it's the deck of slides I've altered most. And the reason is I was talking about AI, and one of the case studies I decided to take on was looking at the speed of regulators to jump on what they see as AI issues, and I looked at DeepSeek. So most people, of course, had never heard of DeepSeek a month ago, but it's obviously been launched in a whirlwind of publicity. And the Garante, the Italian Data Protection Authority, has a track record of looking at AI applications. People remember we've talked on this podcast before about the Garante opening an investigation into OpenAI in April 2023, which led to the founder of AI performing whatever the Italian is for volte-face, saying that initially the Italian Garante had no power to regulate him, and then within 24 hours saying that pasta was his favorite dish. He loved Prosecco, and that he would be on the next plane to Italy to sort it out. Despite this charm offensive that OpenAI launched, they were fined 15 million euros for not having gone through the right processes before launch. And the Garante seems to have it in for DeepSeek as well. So on the 28th of January, I'm hoping that you'll note these dates down for the chronology. On the 28th of January, the Garante announced that it was launching an investigation. On the 30th of January, there's a slightly complicated ownership structure behind DeepSeek, but DeepSeek's owners wrote back to the Garante with what the Garante called a completely insufficient response, and within a day, the Garante had decided to ban DeepSeek's operations in Italy. Now, of course, some people will be getting around that ban by using a VPN or whatever, and the days in which you can completely block content in a country, well, unless you're China, aren't are long gone. But I think it's instructive at the speed of which regulators will act. And of course, on Sunday, the EU AI Act came into force, or at least its initial provisions dealing with prohibited AI. So this week, regulators got more tools, and I think they got more almost skin in the game to regulate AI. And I think this will be a taste of things to come, with regulators acting quickly, as I say, particularly because they have these new powers as of Sunday. But this isn't just an EU issue. On the 31st of January, so one day later, the South Korean privacy regulator announced that it was following the Garante in launching an investigation. And on the 3rd of February, so there'd been a weekend in between, the Japanese DPA warned about DeepSeek and said that they had questions as well. So I think we can see that AI is definitely going to be a hot topic in the regulatory world. And of course, for many of us, even if we're not heavily engaged in AI, then the business almost certainly is. There'll be either legitimate AI applications that are sanctioned by the business, and I hear reports that some people are thinking of switching to DeepSeek already because of the lower cost model. There'll be bought in applications consciously or subconsciously in areas like HR and recruitment, where AI already seems to be being used significantly. You might have outsourced marketing agencies, for example, that are using AI to write copy, do mail shots, etc. as well. And then the big issue of shadow AI, and that is definitely a worry. A colleague of mine got the train into London and noticed that somebody was reading emails from their work laptop. They had their personal laptop next to them. They're putting in the questions into ChatGPT and then retyping them. So even if your information security people are telling you that nobody's using AI because it's banned on the network, they're wrong. People are. So what do you do if you're a compliance officer to guard against this? Well, I think there is going to be an element of a trade war here. There may be tit for tat. So if you've got employees who are based in China, then expect there to be bans of AI applications over there. I'm going to apologize for the pronunciation in advance, but Gao Jiaxing from the Chinese Foreign Ministry has said that the ministry stands behind DeepSeek in this investigation, so we can expect some sort of geopolitical issues there. So if you're a chief compliance officer, well, obviously training and awareness has to be item number one. You're not going to get rid of shadow AI unless you get hearts and minds. This is a case where you need more carrot, less stick. Explain to people the risks. Give them tools that they need to do the job if you can in a safe environment, but train them on the risks. And we already have surveys. LRN did a survey in there last year about Gen Z's attitude to policies. So you're going to have to explain to them why it is necessary rather than just say, here's a stick. If you do it, I'm going to beat you with it. Policies obviously have to be appropriate. They have to be up to date. You can't just try the hands over eyes, fingers in ears approach, A, because you haven't got enough hands, but B, because it doesn't work anyway. So have a proper policy, acknowledge the fact that this issue is happening, and think of proper guidelines, and include the Gen Z people when you're developing these policies. You've got to include those people who are at the front line actually doing this stuff. If you're going to have applications in the tent, then you've got to look at terms and conditions. Where's the data going? All of that legal stuff. You're going to have to find out the AI that's being used in the business already. So do an inventory. And then you're also going to have to look at the way in which you treat the product. I was on the New York State Bar Association AI task force. We produced some top tip sheets for things like that. If anybody wants a copy, then I'll mail them over. But the moral of the story is, I think regulators are on the case. The issue isn't going to go away. There's significant risks for corporations. You're going to have to do something about it.
All right. Well done, gents and ladies. All right, let's do some shout outs and rants. And Matt, I know you got a deadline, so why don't you start us off?
Sure. I am going to start off with a shout out this week. For anybody who is watching on video, I will hold this up. But for anybody who is not and just listening, I will tell you, I am reading the memoir of Alexei Navalny, Patriot, which was published in December. And for any anti-corruption or corporate ethics person, you should read this book. Be warned, it will rip your guts out, because we already know how his story ends. Navalny was essentially murdered in a Russian prison camp, if not at the direct order of Vladimir Putin, certainly allowed to die. And the whole book is lucid and detailed and vivid and really well written. And Navalny has no idea what's actually going to happen to him at the end. And we do. And so that just adds this whole heartbreaking overshadow to his tale about how his country essentially fell apart in the 1990s. A lot of striking parallels one cannot help but make and think about today, what is happening in our country versus how oligarchs carved up Russia in the 1990s and put it on the path where it is today. But if you take anti-corruption seriously, if you think that we are doing this for a good purpose, you should read this book about a man who committed himself to it. And I think the worst part for me was the very first chapter where I'll just tell you, he was setting the scene of how he was first poisoned, I think in early 2020 on an internal Russian flight, and how people were trying to keep him alive, which they did at that point. And he describes how everybody on the plane was telling him, don't die, don't die, don't die. And the last word of that first chapter is, spoiler alert, I didn't die. And you read that knowing he's dead. And it hits you like few books I have ever hit me. I'll stop there, read the book. It is one of the best things I could imagine a compliance officer would ever want to get their hands on.
All right. Mr. Armstrong, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
Yeah, well, Karen normally gets the culture references, but I'll get one in first. One of the best lines in film, I think, is nobody's perfect. And maybe we'll have in the LinkedIn chat the first one to remember the film gets a prize. But it sprung to mind, I think, when I was looking at the appointment of Lord Mandelson as the new UK ambassador to the US. Now, it's difficult to think who would be the perfect ambassador to the court of King Donald. It's going to need somebody who's able to think on their feet fast and able to adapt. When I was about 24, 25, I was asked by my then boss to stand in at a business meeting. And to cut a very, very long story short, I ended up working with Peter Mandelson, as he then was, on an initiative to promote enterprise. So I'm a very junior lawyer, and Peter was a great guide through that whole process and politics. And for all his appearance as somebody who was very aloof, to me, I can remember going into quite an important meeting, arriving in the room early and finding Peter Mandelson emptying the bin in the room. And I said, you're the last person on this earth I thought would be emptying the bin. And he just said to me, Jonathan, who do you think does that? And so I think, as I say, nobody's perfect for this role, but I know from personal experience that he cares a lot about industry. He knows a lot about trade from his time at the European Commission, amongst other things. He's a thoughtful person, one who can read a room, one that is prepared to empty bins and roll his sleeves up. Be under no illusion, I think we're in for a difficult road in relations between the UK and the US and the EU and the US. Mandelson will have some tough decisions as to whether he sides with his former colleagues at the European Commission or goes it alone. It's a difficult time for all of our countries. As I say, nobody's perfect, but I'm hoping that Mandelson will give it his best.
Mr. Marks, do you have a shout out and or rant, noting you're wearing a green shirt today?
EAGLES, Eagles. Yeah, I got a shout out to my birds who were playing in the Super Bowl on Sunday. Wishing them all the best. Whatever happens, he had a great season. So good luck there. And then my rant is that the mayor of Philadelphia does not know how to spell Eagles, yet somebody is actually profiting from that by creating T-shirts with the word Eagles spelled incorrectly, as I believe Mayor Parker announced during a press conference. So fun times here in Philadelphia.
Karen Woody, what do you have for us today?
I'm going to piggyback on a cultural reference just because, given the insanity that is swirling around in the world right now and all the tragedy that's happening, I had the opportunity this week to go see Hadestown, the national touring company of that Broadway musical. And I have to say, it was one of the most enjoyable couple hours I've had in recent memory, just to be taken completely out of the news cycle or anything else and just hear some of the most unbelievable music and some of the most talented actors. I know it won the Tony for Best Musical, and so I'm very late to this party. I get it, but I will just say it's well deserved and an excellent, excellent show. So go see it if you can.
Karen Moore.
Well, I am also going to put in a cultural reference, not quite so enjoyable maybe, but I did see last week the film September 5, which covers the hostage taking of the Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Games. It is, for me, one of the very first news events that I really recall getting engaged in, watching in real time. In those days, we were all glued to watching the Olympics, and all of this came up. This film shows the perspective of the media covering the event and the issues that they have to deal with. If there is a hostage executed, do we show it live? What about the victims' families? Etc. So grappling with some of the ethical issues alongside a lot of the technical issues, the fact that they actually needed to rush film and develop film, cut film, show film, I mean, it's a really different time, something that resonates in my memory. So if you have, read the Navalny book and still not jumped off a bridge, this is not an uplifting film. I will not say how it ends, because I suppose there are a lot of people, unlike me, that maybe don't recall how the story ends, and I'll let that tension unfold, because I think that the media coverage of it does a really great job at kind of displaying the degree of uncertainty when you're covering things in real time without a lot of access to information. So September 5, it had very limited release, but I encourage you to go see it, and then go see Hadestown for something a little bit more uplifting and fun and entertaining.
Well, I'm going to shout out to well-known sports podcaster Bill Simmons. Bill Simmons has a twin who lives in his head called Conspiracy Bill. And Conspiracy Bill had one of the greatest conspiracies ever, which he gave us this past week. It starts off with the Dallas Mavericks giving away the third best player in the world, Luka Doncic, to the Los Angeles Lakers. And many thought it was just to save the Lakers. But it turns out it's even more nefarious, because the owner of the Mavericks is now Miriam Adelson. Well, she is the widow of Sheldon Adelson, one of the top gambling brokers who brought online gambling to America. Well, the great state of Texas does not allow online gambling. So Simmons says her ploy was to get Texas to approve online gambling. The next day, the governor of Texas said he supports online gambling. But Bill Simmons was not finished, because he says it's even more nefarious, because if gambling doesn't go through the Texas legislature, she's going to tank the team further and then move it to Las Vegas, her hometown, which does allow online gambling. So shout out Bill Simmons, taking it down 4 levels on your conspiracy. It doesn't get any better than that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great, great, great episode. I hope we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay, we're off recording. Good luck Saturday, Jonathan. Sunday.
I'll be there. I'll wait.
How
for
did
you.
they misspell Eagles?
She's E-L.
Elgies?
Yeah, if you Google Shirley Parker, whatever her name is, the mayor of Philadelphia, she spells the damn thing wrong.
Well done. All right, guys.
Good job.
Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Cheers. Bye.
Well,